And we are live. Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you guys join me soon. But I will be covering chapter 22. We're in the home stretch. The last couple of chapters on the compendium, which I'll cover the next couple of days. And so there's 26 chapters total. This is 22. And this will cover Detente, which includes the years 1961 to 1977, which involves the administrations of JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Ford. So this chapter, what I'm showing you, is on our website. Our website is www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia. Link should be in the description. And this is chapter 22 of the compendium. So if you go to the menu, hover over an arrow, and you can look through all these chapters. So the chapter that we're covering today is Detente. And this chapter, like all chapters, is divided into sections, and each section is going to have its own timeline. What you see here, this is an interactive timeline with a bunch of primary source documents and events. And since this is more in the modern video age, we have a bunch of videos from the time period. So, like, for example, this is Nixon's first inaugural address. You can actually watch the entire address directly from our website if you want to. And so let's get into the first section of this chapter. It's called Get America Moving Again, which is a campaign slogan used by JFK. And so this is going to be 1961 and 1969. And this section will include the JFK administration and the LBJ administration. So let me read the description for this section. JFK's new frontier promised renewed national purpose, the centerpiece of which was the space race, but his presidency had immediate setbacks by the Bay of Pigs invasion, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. At home, mass protest reshaped American democracy as the civil rights movement culminated in the March on Washington and the introduction of landmark civil rights legislation, right when JFK's assassination in 1963 shattered public hopes. LBJ used his martyrdom to push through the Great Society, passing the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, while expanding federal responsibility for education, healthcare, and social welfare. Yet the escalation of the Vietnam War fractured public trust, fueling widespread protest, while urban unrest during the long hot summer, also known as the Summer of Love, of 1967, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968 revealed a nation struggling to reconcile democratic ideals with violence, inequality, and an increasingly unpopular war. Pretty exciting section. So we have JFK's first inaugural address. I believe this is the first full video that we have of a president's inauguration. All the other inaugurations, we just have the audio for them. You have JFK's 1961 State of the Union address, which he gave on January 30th. You have Yuri Gagarin. He is the first man in space, and he does this voyage on April 12th, 1961. So Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space aboard Vostok 1, completing one orbit around Earth in a 108-minute flight launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome. His single orbit proved humans could survive launch, weightlessness, and re-entry. His successful mission marked a major victory for the Soviet Union in the space race, intensifying Cold War competition and inspiring the United States to accelerate its own manned space program. You have the Bay of Pigs invasion. a CIA-backed force of Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. The invasion fails. JFK will give a statement on the Bay of Pigs invasion, and I have a video of that. And then you have Alan Shepard. He becomes the first American in space, completing a 15-minute suborbital flight aboard Freedom 7 in the Mercury Redstone 3 mission. His mission marked a major milestone for NASA and the United States in the early space race against the Soviet Union. You have 2 buses of the Freedom Riders attacked. Civil rights activists challenging segregation in interstate bus travel were violently attacked by mobs in Alabama, including in Anniston and Birmingham. The assaults drew national attention, prompting federal intervention and highlighting the intense resistance to desegregation in the South. JFK gives an address to Congress about going to space. This is not the other address that is more famous, but this one was given directly to Congress. JFK will go on a tour in Western Europe and will also go to Vienna for the Vienna Summit, where President JFK met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna to discuss Cold War tensions, including Berlin and nuclear arms. The summit revealed sharp disagreements, with Khrushchev taking a hard line that contributed to the later construction of the Berlin Wall and escalating East-West tensions. You have a Supreme Court decision, Mapp v. Ohio, and so I have a video by Mr. Beat about this Supreme Court decision, so check out his channel. The Berlin Wall is built in August of 1961 during the JFK administration. A lot of people think that it was built right after World War II. It was actually built much later. East Germany, with Soviet backing, erected the Berlin Wall to stop the mass exodus of citizens from East to West Berlin. In the 1962 State of the Union address, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth. John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, completing 3 full revolutions. His mission demonstrated American orbital endurance and spacecraft control. Glenn emerged as a national hero and symbol of U.S. technological resilience. At Baker v. Carr, another Supreme Court decision. JFK's address on steel price hikes. You have Engel v. Vitale. JFK, Why We Go to the Moon speech. This is the famous one, where he's at Rice University, where he talks about the moon. And so we have a video of that you can watch directly on the timeline. And shortly after giving this speech, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So here's one of the original photos of taken of Cuba and the Soviets moving missiles to Cuba. So day 1 of the meeting, morning meeting on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Day 2, JFK's meeting, evening meeting on the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK meets with Andrei Gromyko, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, who asserts the USSR is not only acting defensively. The president does not reveal that he is now aware of the missile buildup. JFK goes to Ohio, but then is quickly returned to D.C. You have JFK's meeting with Walter Sweeney, General Walter Sweeney of the Tactical Air Command, who tells him that an airstrike could not guarantee 100% destruction of the missiles. JFK will give an address to the nation on the Cuban Missile Crisis and begin the Cuban blockade. A U-2 is shot down over Cuba, and the pilot, Rudolph Anderson, is killed. Khrushchev will send 2 letters to Kennedy, and Kennedy will give this response to Khrushchev. After 2 years, JFK gives this interview in the Oval Office. JFK's 1963 State of the Union address. You have Governor Wallace's inaugural address for Alabama governor. This is the famous address where he says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So this is the height of civil rights, well, maybe not the height yet, but the 1963 to 65 is the height of the civil rights movement. You have Gideon v. Wainwright, Supreme Court decision, and the Birmingham campaign led by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized sit-ins, marches, and boycotts to challenge segregation in one of the South's most racially divided cities. The campaign's images of police dogs and fire hoses used against peaceful protesters shocked the nation and pressured pressured President Kennedy to push for landmark civil rights legislation. MLK, during the Birmingham campaign, is arrested and jailed. And this is where he writes his letter from a Birmingham jail. MLK Jr.'s interview with Susskind. JFK's speech at the American University commencement. Wallace stands in front of the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama in order to stop racial integration, and he is confronted by U.S. Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach. JFK announces his Civil Rights Bill. This is the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1964, but right now it's just a bill. On the same night, Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader of the NAACP, is shot to death. Valentina Tereshkova becomes the first woman in space and remains the only woman to fly a solo orbital mission. She orbited the Earth 48 times over nearly 3 days. Her flight reinforced Soviet claims of social and technological superiority. Shubert v. Werner, Supreme Court decision. Kennedy's Berlin speech. This is where he says that I am a Berliner, even though he's not. For Freedom Now, this was an interview between the top 5 civil rights leaders. Let's see if I can remember them. You have Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. You have, I think this is James Foreman, Martin Luther King Jr. I know, so one of them is the NAACP, one of them is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, one of them is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, one is CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, and then the other is the National Urban League. You have JFK's address on the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, one of the first nuclear treaties that we will sign with the Soviet Union. Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed. MLK gives his I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington. You have a Birmingham church bombing where white supremacists bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. You have Diem, assassinated in a U.S.-backed coup. So Diem was supported by the U.S., and then he was no longer favored, especially by the CIA. And so we supported the people who couped him, and he is assassinated during the coup. You have JFK's final speech that he gave the day that he died in the morning. And then we have a video. We have to watch it on YouTube. It is age restricted, but this is the Zapruder film, stabilized and enhanced, of the JFK assassination. Later that day, on um, November 22nd, LBJ takes the oath of office, and we have the audio from his oath. So this audio comes from this recording device that you see right here, which is kind of cool. This is not so cool. Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald. This is Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, as Lee Harvey Oswald was being escorted out of the jail. LBJ address to Congress following JFK's death. This is where LBJ will ask Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1963, which will be signed in 1964. LBJ gives his 1964 State of the Union address. You have a Supreme Court decision, New York Times v. Sullivan. LBJ's message to Congress on the war on poverty. And so LBJ, once the Civil Rights Bill is passed, LBJ will focus away from racial issues and go to economic issues, poverty. So this is where you get the Great Society idea. You have LBJ's Great Society speech, speaking of, where he talks about trying to advocate for this idea of the Great Society. 3 core activists are killed. CORE stands for Congress on Racial Equality in Mississippi. I have to find the image again. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by LBJ. Barry Goldwater's acceptance speech at the 1964 RNC, which happens later that month. Then you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an alleged attacks on U.S. Navy ships by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. This turns out to be false. There was no attack. They made it up. And this was used to justify the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president the power to use military force in Vietnam. So this is the beginning of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. You have the Economic Opportunity Act, passed under LBJ as part of his war on poverty. Yeah, protests outside the DNC about the about a lot of things. One of them is the 3 core activists killed, and then a bunch of other issues, economic issues, voting rights is another issue that will become important during the in 1965, so the next year. You have the famous Daisy ad by the LBJ campaign, where a girl was counting daisies, and then a nuclear explosion goes off. Ronald Reagan gives a speech called A Time for Choosing, and he is advocating for Barry Goldwater. You know, the election of Johnson, LBJ wins against Barry Goldwater. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Nobel Peace Prize lecture. So usually when someone wins the Nobel Peace Prize, they have to give a lecture. I'm not sure if they have to, but they usually give a lecture before they receive the Peace Prize. Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. v. U.S. A segregation case. Same thing with Katzenbach v. McClung. LBJ's 1965 State of the Union address. LBJ's inauguration, 1965. Of course, second term, technically. And then you have this very famous debate between, at least it should be famous, debate between Baldwin and Buckley. Buckley will found the National Review. I think that's, yeah, the National Review. And then Baldwin was a civil rights advocate. I wouldn't say he was a leader, but he was an advocate. And the debate was on whether or not the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And Baldwin argues that it is, while Buckley will argue that the American dream isn't putting down anyone, but instead it's lifting everyone up. And the assassination of Malcolm X. And so this is the aftermath of his shooting. I do want to clarify, Malcolm X was not a civil rights leader. The whole goal of the civil rights movement, was desegregation. Malcolm X did not advocate for desegregation. He wanted to maintain segregation, but he wanted to elevate the economic status of black people. So he was, I wouldn't go so far as to say a black separatist, in the sense like he wanted a independent black America nation. But he did want black communities, to be separate and to have better economic, I guess, conditions. He was not advocating for desegregation. Him and the Nation of Islam were against that. So he was. We don't consider him on this timeline to be a civil rights leader, but his death does come at pretty close to the death of an actual civil rights leader, Jimmy Lee Jackson. So on February 18th, 1965, while unarmed and participating in a peaceful voting rights march in his city, he was beaten by troopers and fatally shot by an Alabama state trooper. Jackson died 8 days later in the hospital. His death helped inspire the Selma to Montgomery marches in March of 1965, a major event in the civil rights movement that helped gain congressional passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This enabled millions of African Americans to vote in Alabama and across the southern United States, regaining participation as citizens in the political system for the first time since the turn of the 20th century. Most had been disenfranchised since then by state constitutions and discriminatory practices that made voter registration and voting more difficult. So, this is a civil rights leader that we should be inspired by, not Malcolm X. I don't think any of us should be inspired by Malcolm X, because he wasn't a civil rights leader. Jimmy Lee Jackson was, Martin Luther King Jr. was, Roy Wilkins was, and James Foreman, James Farmer, and so many other people are actual civil rights leaders that we can learn from and be inspired by. And during this time, you have Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a sustained U.S. bombing campaign against North Vietnam, aimed at weakening enemy supply lines, industrial capacity, and morale. Despite massive airstrikes, the operation failed to break North Vietnam's will, instead escalating the conflict and deepening American involvement in the Vietnam War. The operation ended in November of 1968. The famous Selma to Montgomery March, following the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a civil rights leader in Alabama, the marches were organized by non-violent activists to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of segregationist repression. They were part of a broader voting rights movement underway in Selma and throughout the American South. By highlighting racial injustice, they contributed to passage of that year of the Voting Rights Act, and mark a landmark federal achievement in the civil rights movement. So on the first day of the Selma to Montgomery March, you have Bloody Sunday. An estimated 525 to 600 civil rights marchers headed southeast out of Selma on U.S. Highway 80. The march was led by John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Reverend Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, followed by Bob Mance of SNCC and Albert Turner of the SCLC. The protest went according to plan until marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they encountered a wall of state troopers and county posse waiting for them on the other side. In all, 17 marchers were hospitalized and 50 treated for lesser injuries. John Lewis will receive a pretty massive head trauma during this event, and he will become famous. He only died, what, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, pretty recently. You have American Promise, LBJ's address to Congress on the Voting Rights Act, where the Voting Rights Bill is proposed. Alexei Leonov becomes the first man to perform a spacewalk for the Soviets. Our God is Marching On is a speech given by Martin Luther King Jr. During the Selma to Montgomery March. During this time, LBJ gives a statement on the arrest of 4 KKK members. LBJ's remarks on the Vietnam conflict at Johns Hopkins University. Edward White becomes the first American to perform a spacewalk. LBJ's commencement speech at Howard University talks about voting rights in the Great Society. You have Griswold v. Connecticut, a Supreme Court decision about contraception. You have the Social Security amendments, which will create Medicare and Medicaid, so the expansion of the welfare system. And then you have the Voting Rights Act, signed in 1965. You also have the Hart-Celler Act, which abolished the national origins quota system, replacing it with a preference-based immigration policy focused on family reunification and skilled workers. The law significantly reshaped U.S. immigration, leading to increased diversity and a surge in immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The Constitution of Connecticut, Reagan's myth of the Great Society. So this is a speech by Ronald Reagan in the 60s denouncing the Great Society. You have LBJ's 1966 State of the Union address. Luna 10 is launched, and it became the first spacecraft to orbit the moon. And this was a Soviet mission. You have Miranda v. Arizona, pretty devastating case. I'm not really a big fan of Miranda or calling it Miranda rights. I don't think that we should honor this guy's name. He was a pretty evil guy. But here's a Supreme Court decision video of it, if you want, by Mr. Beat. You have LBJ's 1967 State of the Union address. You have the infamous Apollo 1 tragedy. It wasn't called Apollo 1 at the beginning. It was renamed Apollo 1. And during it, a cabin fire during a pre-launch test kills Grissom, White, and Chaffee. The tragedy revealed fatal design flaws in the command module and hatch. It grounded the program for over a year. While major safety and design changes were implemented, Apollo 1 never flew, but shaped NASA's safety culture permanently. This mission is renamed Apollo 1 afterwards. Apollo 2 and 3 didn't happen, so the next mission will be Apollo 4. You have the Long Hot Summer, which is a interesting time. It's during the Summer of Love of 1967. So yeah, I have a bunch of race riots, over 150 race riots. We don't have all 150, but we do have a lot, many of them. You have MLK Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech. So this is pretty much when historians and textbooks just forget about MLK Jr. until his death. So they have like his I Have a Dream speech and then they skip to his death. But between his I Have a Dream speech and his death, he will speak out against America's involvement in Vietnam. And I think that's why most historians or textbooks don't include this time period of MLK Jr.'s life because he's against U.S. involvement abroad, especially in Vietnam. And so we want to include Martin Luther King Jr. in the timeline. You have the Cairo riots in Cairo, Illinois. A riot erupted after tensions between black residents and local police, reflecting long-standing racial discrimination and economic inequality. The unrest caused property damage and several injuries, and it was contained after law enforcement restored order. No deaths are reported in this riot. You have a speech by MLK Jr. on the Other America. This will tackle economic issues. At the Tampa riots, minor disturbances occurred in African American neighborhoods over segregation and police harassment, with some looting and property damage. Police intervened to end the unrest, resulting in several arrests, but no fatality. You have the Buffalo riot. Following rumors of police brutality, small-scale riots broke out in black neighborhoods, leading to property damage and dozens of arrests. Law enforcement restored order after a couple of days. There were no deaths reported. The Rochester riot, tensions over racial inequality in low-income neighborhoods sparked clashes between residents and police. The riots caused minor property damage and multiple arrests, but were quickly contained without fatalities. You have a Supreme Court decision in Galt, which again you can watch a video by Mr. Beat on that. Here's another Supreme Court decision, Loving v. Virginia, about interracial marriage. The Glassboro Summit, where LBJ and the Soviet Premier Kosygin met at Glassboro, New Jersey, for a summit aimed at easing Cold War tensions following the Six-Day War. While no major agreements were signed, the informal discussions helped improve communication, reduce misunderstandings, and maintain dialogue between the superpowers. This is before you had the internet. You have the Cincinnati riots, sparked by a confrontation at a pool hall in a black neighborhood. Riots led to 3 deaths, dozens injured, hundreds of arrests with looting and arson reported. The unrest subsided after police and National Guard intervention restored control. You have the Newark riots of 1967. The Newark riots began after the arrest and beating of a taxi driver, John Smith, by police, igniting outrage and in predominantly black neighborhoods. Over 5 days, the city experienced 26 deaths, more than 1,500 injuries, thousands of arrests, and extensive property damage, ending only after the National Guard intervened and imposed order. The Chicago riots. The Chicago riot began following a police confrontation within the predominantly black South Side neighborhoods, fueled by long-standing racial and economic inequalities. Over 9 days, the city saw 5 deaths, hundreds injured, over 1,000 arrests, and extensive property damage, with the National Guard and local police eventually quelling the unrest. You have the Milwaukee riots. A barroom fight in a predominantly black neighborhood escalated into citywide violence, resulting in 1 death, 75 injuries, and 1,700 arrests. Buildings were damaged and looted. The National Guard was deployed, and order was gradually restored over several days. The Tampa riots. Minor riots in Tampa were triggered by racial tensions and conflicts with law enforcement in African American neighborhoods. The disturbances caused 1 death, several injuries, property damage, and arrests, and subsided after police and National Guard intervention restored calm. The Plainfield riots. Lots of riots going on in the summer of 1967. You have the Plainfield, New Jersey riot erupted after tensions between black residents and police in response to perceived harassment and discrimination, with crowds looting and setting fires in the city. The unrest resulted in 2 deaths, around 200 injuries, and widespread property damage, and ended after National Guard deployment and police restoration of order. Then you have the Detroit riots, which began during a police raid at the Algiers Motel in a black neighborhood and quickly spread citywide. It became one of the deadliest, with 43 deaths, over 1,100 injuries, and more than 7,200 arrests. Oof. And widespread property damage, ending only after federal troops and National Guard intervened. And it's after the Detroit riots, or really during the Detroit riots, that LBJ will give an address talking about the riots and about civil disorder in general. And because of these riots, LBJ will establish the Kerner Commission, which is to investigate the causes of racial violence in the United States. You have MLK Jr.'s Three Evils of Society, where he talks about poverty, racism, and oh man, I'm forgetting the third one. Well, you can listen to it yourself if you want. We have the audio for it. You have an anti-Vietnam War march at the Pentagon, organized by the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, and it was the first major national protests against the Vietnam War, marking a significant escalation in the anti-war movement. The event began with more than 100,000 protesters at a rally near Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Later, about 50,000 people marched across the Potomac River to the Pentagon and sparked a confrontation with U.S. Army paratroopers who were stationed there. You have the Apollo 4 mission. This is the first mission after Apollo 1. So Apollo 4 was the first full test of the Saturn V rocket with an uncrewed command and service module. It validated the vehicle's performance for crewed missions. The mission demonstrated a heat shield survival during reentry from lunar return velocities. You have Katz v. United States, a Supreme Court decision. We have a video by Mr. Beat. The LBJ's 1968 State of the Union address. You have the Apollo 5 mission. This is the tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, performing engine firings and separation maneuvers. The mission validated the lunar module systems before crewed testing. It confirmed that the module could operate independently of the command module. Yeah, the Kerner report is published. Report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, called the Kerner Report. So we have a text of that report if you want to read it. And it basically just says, oh, probably shouldn't show that image. This basically just says that the main issue is poverty. So the main issue causing racial violence is poverty, and this is debated even today, whether or not poverty is really the cause of crime. So before this event on March 16th, 1968, you have the My Lai Massacre. I'm not going to share the image. I'm not sure how YouTube will appreciate it, but just in case I'm not going to show it, if you want to look at it, you can on our website. But the My Lai Massacre was a massacre of Vietnamese civilians by U.S. troops, and it sickens me that virtually none of the soldiers were actually punished for the My Lai Massacre, and some of them were rewarded, not for the massacre, but still, I think that should be a correction in U.S. military history, where we recognize when a massacre against civilians is done, and any soldier who participated in such a massacre should be dishonored. And on the same day that the massacre happened, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, launches his 1968 presidential campaign. LBJ will announce later that month that he will not run for re-election. So I have the video of that happening. We have MLK Jr.'s final speech that I gave on April 3rd, 1968. This is the famous speech where he says, "I have been to the mountaintop." We have the Apollo 6 mission, second Saturn V test, unmanned. MLK Jr. is shot at around 7 p.m. April 4th, 1968. I think that's 7 p.m. EST. And then you have the MLK riots that happen shortly after his shooting and will last for a week. So this is known as the Holy Week Uprising, where a wave of civil disturbance across the United States followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The biggest riot took place in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, and Kansas City. LBJ proclaims a state of emergency in D.C. LBJ proclaims a state of emergency in Chicago and Baltimore. And then you have the Civil Rights Act of 1968 to address poverty. You have U.S. v. O'Brien. Robert Kennedy is killed, so we have his final speech that he gave shortly before his assassination. So if you want to watch this speech, you can directly on the timeline, or you can on our YouTube channel, Tarpain Archives, where we have a bunch of archival audio and video. So shortly after delivering a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in LA, following his win in the California Democratic primary, the assassination left a profound impact on the 1968 presidential election, creating a leadership void within the DNC and intensifying its internal divisions. Kennedy had been a leading candidate, and his death shifted the momentum toward Hubert Humphrey, who secured the Democratic nomination amid widespread protests at the Democratic National Convention. So if you want to watch his final speech that he gave right before he got shot, you can. And then this video also includes some of the aftermath of him being shot at the hotel. You have Terry v. Ohio, June 10th, 1968, Supreme Court decision. And again, this is a Mr. Beat video, if you want to watch. They have the Non-Proliferation Treaty and LBJ's address. And so we sign, I think this is the second treaty we signed with the Soviet Union on nuclear arms. Nixon gives his acceptance speech at the 1968 RNC. You have the Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček, who sought socialism with a human face through reforms like freedom of the press and speech. The movement was crushed in August when Warsaw Pact forces, led by the Soviet Union, invaded the country, reaffirming Moscow's control and deepening Cold War tensions with the West. You have Hubert Humphrey's acceptance speech at the 1968 DNC, and this was a wild time for the Democrats because you have a bunch of anti-Vietnam War protests, you have a bunch of civil rights protests, you have a bunch of people protesting over poverty and over issues like with Israel and Palestine. Back then, it's like a lot of craziness that really divided the Democratic Party and allowed Nixon to take the win. Apollo 7 mission is the first crewed flight of Apollo. Nixon on Face the Nation. LBJ's cessation of bombing of North Vietnam. Then you have the Brezhnev Doctrine, declared that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country threatened by internal or external forces, undermining communist rule. This policy heightened Cold War tensions as it justified Soviet intervention in Eastern Europe, strained U.S.-Soviet relations, and limited American influence in the region. You have the election of Nixon. Nixon wins over Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. So George Wallace will be the Southern Democrat candidate, while Hubert Humphrey is the, I guess, the normal Democratic candidate. The Apollo 8 mission, first men to orbit the moon, Borman, Lovell, and Anders. And this is where they photograph the Earthrise. I want to add that to the event on the timeline, that image. And then you have LBJ's 1969 State of the Union address, which is his final address as the president, at least to Congress. So all this craziness, all this history, has just been 8 years from JFK to LBJ. And so now we go into the next section, which is called Bring Us Together, 1969 and 1977. So the next 8 years, which covers the Nixon and Ford administrations. So for this section, the Nixon and Ford years unfolded amid extraordinary achievement and profound crisis as the United States landed men on the moon, even while the nation fractured at home over war, race, and political authority. Nixon pursued Detente abroad, opening relations with China and signing the SALT I Treaty with the Soviet Union, while domestically the Vietnam War sparked violent unrest, from the Kent State shootings to bombings of the Capitol, alongside broader social upheaval following events like Stonewall and the killing of Fred Hampton. The credibility of executive power collapsed with the Watergate scandal, revealing systemic abuses and leading to Nixon's unprecedented resignation, while Congress moved to reassert its authority through measures like the War Powers Act. Gerald Ford assumed the presidency, promising stability but deepened national debate by pardoning Nixon, a decision meant to heal the country, yet one that underscored lingering mistrust. By 1977, Americans were left grappling with disillusionment toward government uncertainty about global leadership and unresolved questions about the limits of presidential power. So you have Nixon's first inaugural address that you can watch on the timeline. You have Tinker v. Des Moines, Supreme Court decision. You have the Apollo 9 first crewed lunar module test. You have Apollo 10 full lunar rehearsal. You have Brandenburg versus Ohio about free speech and the KKK. You have Berger swears in as Chief Justice. This begins the Berger Court. You have the Stonewall riots, where police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City's Greenwich Village, because the bar was operating without a proper liquor license, was run by the mafia, and routinely violated laws against serving alcohol to LGBTQ patrons who were themselves targeted by discriminatory public decency statutes. These raids were common harassment tactics by the New York City Police Department's Public Morals Division. The raid sparked several days of protests and clashes involving LGBTQ patrons, local residents, and activists, with both demonstrators and police sustaining injuries, widely seen as the catalyst for the modern gay liberation movement. Stonewall galvanized nationwide organizing, leading to the formation of advocacy groups and the first Pride marches the following year. You have the Apollo 11, first moon landing, where Armstrong and Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon, while Collins orbited above. They deployed scientific experiments and collected samples. The mission fulfilled Kennedy's goal and was the most iconic milestone in space history. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam, dies during this time. Nixon will give an address about Vietnam. Apollo 12, the second moon landing, the assassination of Fred Hampton, Nixon's address on progress toward peace in Vietnam, Nixon's 1970 State of the Union address, Apollo 13, aborted lunar landing. You have the first Earth Day, largest single day protest in U.S. history with over 20 million participants. That is an insane number of people. That happened on April 22nd, 1970. I don't know why Europe is missing, but whatever. You have Nixon's address on the Cambodian incursion. So the United States will attack Cambodia in order to target Vietnamese or Viet Cong passages. You have the Kent State shootings, which happened on May 4th, 1970. The Ohio National Guard troops opened fire on students protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9. The tragedy sparked a nationwide outrage, intensifying anti-war sentiment and deepening divisions over the Vietnam War. So here's a very famous photograph from the Kent State shootings that should be in every textbook, history textbook. Nixon's 1971 State of the Union address, where he talks about the ongoing Vietnam War, and especially the protests against the Vietnam War. You have Apollo 14, which is the third moon landing with Shepard and Mitchell. You have the Capitol bombing by the Weather Underground. The radical left-wing Weather Underground bombed a restroom in the U.S. Capitol to protest U.S. military involvement in Laos, aiming to draw attention to their opposition to the Vietnam War. No one was killed or injured, but the attack heightened security fears in Washington during the Nixon era, leading to stricter monitoring of domestic radical groups and raising public anxieties about political violence at home. You have a Supreme Court decision, Lemon v. Kurtzman, and I encourage you guys to go to Mr. Beat's channel and watch this video about that Supreme Court decision. Here's another one. The Pentagon Papers case, New York Times company versus the United States, another Supreme Court decision. You have the Apollo 15, fourth moon landing. You have the Nixon shock, where Nixon ends the gold standard, so the suspension of the U.S. dollar's convertibility into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system and the international gold standard. This Nixon shock allowed the dollar to float freely on currency markets, aiming to curb inflation and stabilize the U.S. economy amid raising trade deficits. You have the Four-Power Treaty, signed September 3rd, 1971, where the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France signed the agreement on Berlin, reaffirming their collective rights and responsibilities over Berlin and Germany broadly. The agreement improved travel and communication between East and West Berlin, easing Cold War tensions and laying the groundwork for future East-West agreements. So a lot of people consider this to be the beginning of Detente, which is the name of this chapter, Detente. Although for us, we include the JFK and LBJ administrations because Detente, at least the progress, the agreements with the Soviet Union working towards Detente begins with JFK and the first nuclear treaty that we signed with the Soviet Union during the JFK administration. So a lot of people give only Nixon credit, but JFK and LBJ deserve at least some credit to Detente. I have Nixon's 1972 State of the Union address, which you guys can watch on the timeline or go to the Tarpan Archives YouTube channel. That's one of our YouTube channels where we re-upload archival video and audio of not just the presidents, but mainly the presidents, but also other documents and archival videos as well. We have this video where Nixon announces his plan for peace in Vietnam, This is in 1972, so this is already towards the end of his first term, where he announces, finally, the plan for peace, even though he campaigned on it in 1969 or 1968. And the Apollo 16, this is the first this is the fifth moon landing with Young and Duke. You have the SALT I Treaty, the first major arms control agreement of the Cold War. The treaty limited the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers and included the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, establishing a framework to curb the nuclear arms race. During the 1972 presidential campaign, George Wallace, a Southern Democrat, is shot. So Alabama, he was also the Alabama governor. He is shot and seriously wounded by Arthur Bremer while campaigning in Laurel, Maryland. The attack left him permanently paralyzed and abruptly derailed his campaign, effectively ending his bid for the Democratic nomination. The assassination attempt eliminated his viability as a national candidate, contributing to the fragmentation of the Democratic primary field and opening the path for George McGovern's nomination and Richard Nixon's landslide victory in the general election. So you have to understand, the Democratic Party is split. It has been split since 1860, with Stephen Douglas in the North and John Breckinridge in the South in the 1860 election. And by the 1972 election, the Democrats are still split between the more progressive North and the very conservative South. So if you were to map out the political parties on like a progressive conservative scale, the most progressive would be the Northern Democrats, and I guess the Western Democrats. The moderates would, when it comes to race issues in Vietnam, would be the Republicans, and then the far right would be the Southern Democrats. So the Democratic Party has both the far left and the far right at this time. And then in the 1972 election is what kills the far right Southern Democratic Party with the shooting of George Wallace. So his shooting is what led to the death of the Southern Democratic Party. And most of the Southern Democrats, who are mostly conservative, will join the Republicans, because the Republicans are mostly moderate at this time, and which is further to the right than the far left Democrats, the progressive Democrats, the New Frontier and Great Society Democrats. And so the far right Democrats join the Republican Party. So a lot of people mistake this, including Mr. Beat and a bunch of historians. They say that the parties switch. The parties didn't switch. It was just that one of the parties, Southern Democrats, died. They're no longer a thing. And those people would join the Republicans as being the most conservative party left versus the progressive Democrats. So you have to understand the dynamics, the political dynamics going on in the country at this time. We have the Wisconsin v. Yoder Supreme Court decision, and here's a Mr. Beat video on that if you want to watch it. You have the Moscow Summit of 1972, where President Nixon traveled to Moscow for a landmark summit with Soviet leader Brezhnev, the first visit to the Soviet capital by the U.S. president. The summit produced the SALT I Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, key agreements that marked a major step in nuclear arms control and Cold War detente. During this time, you have the infamous Watergate scandal, where 5 men were caught breaking into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. And here's an image of the Watergate Hotel. Attempting to install listening devices and gather intelligence. The break-ins was directly linked to operatives associated with President Nixon's re-election campaign, marking the start of the Watergate scandal. Then you have the infamous smoking gun tape in a recorded Oval Office conversation. President Nixon instructed Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman to have the CIA pressure the FBI to halt its investigation into the Watergate break-in. This action demonstrated Nixon's direct involvement in obstructing justice. Just days after the crime, the tape would later become known as the smoking gun. This tape would not be made public until August 5th, 1974, so 2 years later. At Furman v. Georgia, a Supreme Court decision in 1972, McGovern's acceptance speech at the DNC, which you can watch. You have the election of Nixon. He beats McGovern. You have the Apollo 17 mission. This is the sixth and final moon landing with Cernan and Schmidt. You have the Watergate trial. James McCord and G. Gordon Liddy were convicted, while the remaining 5 defendants pled guilty. The trial's conclusion was significant because McCord's subsequent letter to Judge John Sirica, sent on March 19th, 1973, alleged perjury and political pressure, directly opening the case and propelling Watergate into a far larger scandal. This happens during the second inauguration of Nixon. While all this craziness is happening, you have the last moon landing, you have the Watergate trial, you also have Roe v. Wade happening, and Nixon's second inaugural address. Kissinger's press conference on the Paris Peace Accords, that's to end the war in Vietnam, which I have the video of Kissinger's press conference, if you want to watch it. This, of course, is the 1973 Peace Accords, which established a ceasefire and outlined the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam, while affirming the territorial integrity of both North and South Vietnam. Though it temporarily halted American involvement, the agreement failed to secure lasting peace, and fighting soon resumed between North and South, and the North will win against the South after the U.S. forces left Vietnam. In Nixon's 1973 State of the Union, I don't know why, but Nixon, during his 1973 State of the Union, he doesn't give it in person to Congress, like how most State of the Unions at this time are done. Instead, he decides to cut it up into a bunch of parts, I think like 8 parts, and each part is like 50, 100 pages long read. So right now I just have part 1 on the timeline. I don't know why Nixon decided to do it this way. He only does it this way in 1973. He goes back to the normal way in later years, but I don't know why Nixon did it that way for this year. The Senate Watergate Committee is established. The U.S. Senate voted to establish the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities to investigate Watergate. Chaired by Senator Sam Erwin, the committee began televised hearings that riveted the nation. These hearings shifted Watergate from legal scandal to a full political crisis. So eventually I will add each of the televised hearings of this committee to the timeline so that people can watch them, like I did for the Jan 6 committee, which I will talk about when I get to that chapter. The last troops leave Vietnam on March 29th, 1973. This is not that famous event with the helicopter leaving. That's done later. And I'll show you. That happens during this section. Let's see, we have Nixon. He gives his first public address regarding the Watergate scandal that you can listen to. And of course, he's downplaying it. He's saying how, he's not a crook, and, doing his Nixon spiel. So he's denying his involvement in the Watergate scandal. Here's a Supreme Court decision, Fronterio v. Richardson, which is about women in male institutions, let's see, the Citadel in Maryland, that university. So you have the Washington Summit in 1973, which happens in June of that year. Soviet leader Brezhnev visited Washington, D.C. for a summit with President Nixon, marking a high point in Cold War detente. The meetings produced agreements on nuclear arms control, expanded trade, and scientific cooperation, symbolizing improved U.S. Soviet relations. This does not last long, as detente will fall apart pretty soon. And the revelation of the White House taping system. Former aide Alexander Butterfield reveals to the Senate Watergate Committee under oath that Nixon had secretly recorded conversations in the Oval Office. His disclosure transformed the investigation by creating the possibility of definitive evidence of presidential misconduct. Control over the tapes quickly became the central issue of the scandal. So you remember that smoking gun tape that I mentioned? That becomes important because of Alexander Butterfield's disclosure of the existence of the tapes to the Senate. So now the Senate is going to be demanding those tapes. On October 20th, 1973, you have the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox after Cox subpoenaed the White House tapes. Richardson and his deputy resigned rather than comply, leaving Solicitor General Robert Bork to carry out the dismissal. The episode triggered widespread outrage and intensified calls for impeachment in Congress. So you have the first impeachment resolution, which is proposed on October 30th, so 10 days after the Saturday Night Massacre. And so in the aftermath of the Saturday Night Massacre, multiple impeachment resolutions were introduced in the House of Representatives. These resolutions were referred to the House Judiciary Committee, formally placing impeachment responsibility within that body. From this point forward, Nixon's presidency was under sustained constitutional review. And during all this craziness, you have the War Powers Act, which is to limit the powers of the president. So most War Powers Acts previous to this one was about granting the president more powers, but now Congress is taking back some of those powers. So instead of expanding power, this law was Congress's attempt to curb unilateral presidential war-making after prolonged conflicts, especially in Vietnam. The resolution aims to require consultation with and reporting to Congress when U.S. forces are deployed, limit the duration of military deployments without congressional approval, and ensure that the collective judgment of both branches applies before engaging in hostilities. Though restraining in intent, the existence of this law underscores how expansive prior delegations of power had become, and has shaped the legal and political expectations of how presidents engage U.S. forces abroad. Nixon's 1974 State of the Union address, which he gave on January 30th, and he will talk about a number of things, mostly Watergate, the end of Vietnam, economic issues, so war on drugs, and stuff like that. Oh, that's another primary source document. If any of you guys can find the video of Nixon announcing his policy on the war on drugs, please send that to me because I want to add that to the timeline. So you have the impeachment resolution passes in House Resolution 803. It is proposed by Representative Peter W. Rodino Jr., a Democrat from New Jersey, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and was adopted the same day by a vote of 410 to 4. It granted the committee subpoena power, authority to take sworn testimony, and access to evidence. The release of edited transcripts. So Nixon released edited transcripts of selected White House tapes in an attempt to satisfy public and congressional demands. The transcripts contained profanity, political cynicism, and evidence of questionable conduct, undermined Nixon's credibility. Rather than ending the controversy, they strengthened the case for impeachment. So what's going on right now with the uh, Epstein cases, where the president is having to release files? Very similar thing, where the president released some of the files, trying to appease Congress, but it only ended up making things worse for Nixon. And now the same thing is happening today. So history doesn't rhyme or doesn't repeat itself directly, but apparently people repeat themselves and the mistakes that they make. So it's important to learn history so you learn from other people's mistakes and hopefully you don't make the same mistake yourselves. The House Judiciary Committee hearings begin on May 9th, 1974. And so this is formal, televised impeachment hearings to determine whether Nixon had committed impeachable offenses. The committee examined evidence related to obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and defiance of congressional authority. The proceedings emphasized constitutional principles rather than partisan politics. So both Republicans and Democrats were turning on Nixon. The Moscow Summit in June to July 1974. President Nixon met with Soviet leader Brezhnev in Moscow to continue advancing Detente despite domestic turmoil over Watergate. The summit produced agreements on trade, nuclear arms, limitations, and scientific cooperation, reinforcing efforts to stabilize U.S.-Soviet relations during the Cold War. You have the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. This is to limit the president's authority to add to the budget, to control the budget with the power of impoundment, which is basically just taking funding for one project or one agency and spending it on something else. Again, the same thing, pretty similar at least, happened with Trump during his first term when he talked about building the wall by moving funding from other programs that Congress allocated funds for and then spending it on the wall. So, again, when people don't learn from history and the mistakes of people from the past, they tend to repeat it. You have the Supreme Court decision, U.S. v. Nixon, July 24th, 1974, and I have a Mr. Beat video on this Supreme Court decision. This one is where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon must surrender the subpoenaed White House tapes. The court rejected Nixon's claim of absolute executive privilege and affirmed that no president is above the law. This decision made the release of the most damaging tapes inevitable, like the smoking gun tape. Articles of impeachment approved by committee. The House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. These charged him with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Bipartisan support for the articles indicated that Nixon would likely be impeached by the full House. So this isn't impeachment. This is just the committee proposing impeachment to the House. Now you have the final release of the smoking gun tape. The White House released a tape from June 23rd, 1972, 2 years prior, revealing Nixon ordering the obstruction of the FBI's investigation. This recording conclusively demonstrated Nixon's personal involvement in the cover-up. Republican congressional leaders soon informed Nixon that conviction in the Senate was certain. And so this will lead to Nixon resigning. And so I have a video of Nixon giving his resignation speech. That happened on August 8th, 1974. If you guys are interested in watching it, you can on the Tarpeian Archives YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel as well. And listen to this address. Nixon will give a final address as president, his farewell address, in the morning of August 9th, so the day after his resignation speech, but right before he actually resigns. And this is his farewell address that we have as well. And then he officially resigns at 11:35 a.m. So this is his actual letter of resignation. It's very short. It just says, "Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon." And that's it. President is gone. Nixon is gone. And he is replaced by Ford literally 25 minutes later. And Ford will give this address. And so this is like his inaugural address where he is sworn in as president. And so we have that video on here as well. And Ford is interesting because Ford is the only vice president to become president, and he wasn't even elected vice president. Someone else was vice president when Nixon was elected, but he died, and Ford replaced him. No, actually, no, he resigned. The vice president resigned, and then Ford replaced him. So both the president and the vice president resigned, and then Ford would become vice president and now president. You have Ford's first address to Congress in 1974, a couple days later, where he talks about his policy regarding domestic affairs and foreign affairs as well. And soon after, he will pardon Nixon. And this is one of the most controversial parts of the Ford administration. This is one of the reasons why he doesn't win re-election, is because he pardoned Nixon. A lot of people wanted to hold a criminal trial for Nixon, but because of this pardon, Nixon couldn't be tried. You have the Vladivostok Summit, where Ford and Brezhnev met at the Vladivostok Summit to advance arms control negotiations during the Cold War. The two leaders agreed in principle to limit strategic nuclear delivery systems, laying groundwork for the eventual SALT II treaty, although the SALT II treaty will not be ratified by the Senate. And the Safe Drinking Water Act, one of many acts from Congress regulating quality and environmental control of the country. You have Ford's 1975 State of the Union address that he gave on January 15, 1975. Now you have the famous Saigon incident, where Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, collapses after the North invade southern Vietnam, and that's where this image comes from. So a lot of people think that this is when the U.S. left Vietnam. No, the U.S. left Vietnam years before. This is when the United States consulate in South Vietnam fled. You have Reagan. He goes on Face the Nation in a televised address. He will be running in the 1976 presidential campaign. He will not win. Carter wins. But I have some of his videos here. You have the Helsinki Accord, which sought to ease Cold War tensions by recognizing European borders, promoting economic and scientific cooperation, and affirming commitments to human rights. While not legally binding, the agreement gave dissidents in Eastern Europe a powerful framework to challenge communist governments and shaped East-West relations for the next decade. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney submitted their resignations as part of the Halloween massacre. So attached to the resignation letters was a memo with their detailed analysis of the perceived problems and possible future strategies for the Ford administration. The analysis blamed the majority of the problems on Robert Hartman, Henry Kissinger, and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. This kicks off the Halloween massacre. So the Halloween massacre happens on November 4th, 1975, where Ford terminated several Nixon holdovers and announced the names of the successors and new cabinet nominees. James R. Schlesinger was replaced by Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. Rumsfeld's deputy and protege, future Vice President Dick Cheney, moved up to be the Chief of Staff, William Colby was replaced by Ambassador and future President George H.W. Bush as director of the CIA. And Henry Kissinger was replaced by Brent Scowcroft as National Security Advisor, while retaining his post as Secretary of State. Ford's 1976 State of the Union Address. Buckley v. Valeo, a Supreme Court decision. Reagan's To Restore America televised address during the 1976 presidential campaign. You have Greg v. George about the death penalty. Mao Zedong dies on September 9th, 1976. He was the leader of Communist China, and this opens up huge possibilities when it comes to the relationship between the United States and China, especially during the Carter administration. You have the National Emergencies Act. This law formalized how a president may declare a national emergency. It did not itself expand a specific new power, but created a framework. Once a national emergency is declared, the president may activate a variety of pre-existing statutory powers, some wartime, some economic or domestic security, that Congress had previously delegated to the executive, in essence, enabling long-term use of emergency powers under regulated procedures. NEA also required the president to notify Congress when declaring an emergency, and it gave Congress the authority to terminate the emergency via a joint resolution, providing at least a formal check on emergency declarations. So whenever you hear the president announcing a state of emergency, at least since 1976, it's because of this act that the president has the power to do that. You have the Ford versus Carter, the first presidential debate. You had some debates in 1960 between Nixon and JFK, but LBJ did not do any debates, and neither did Nixon during the late 60s and 70s. So this is the first presidential debate that will be continued till today during this time period. So we have all four of them that you can watch, or three of them, and then one vice president presidential debate. Here's the second debate. Here's the first vice presidential debate, Dole versus Mondale. That's Bob Dole. And then you have the third presidential debate between Carter and Ford. You have the election of Carter. Carter wins over Ford and Reagan. And we have Carter's victory speech that he gave after being elected. Ford concedes that morning. You have Craig v. Boren, Supreme Court decision. And then the last documents that we have for this section in this chapter is Ford's 1977 State of the Union Address, which he gave on January 12th, 1977. And he begins with a joke about how this is going to be his last State of the Union address, maybe. So he's saying that he might win the presidency in the future. He doesn't, by the way, but it's still a funny joke. I guess you had to be there for it to be funny. And this concludes this section of the chapter. This is chapter 22, or has been chapter 22, Detente. Today I went over the administrations of JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Ford from 1961 to 1977. Tomorrow, I will be going over chapter 23, called Rearmament, and this will cover the administrations of Carter and Reagan from 1977 to 1989. And so, stay tuned tomorrow for that live stream. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channels. We have a number of them. The main one is Tarpeian Archives. And what I've been showing you tonight has been our website. Our website is www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. And this has been chapter 22 of the compendium. So if you go in the menu, look at the different eras, this has been Detente. Tomorrow will be rearmament. So thank you for watching. I hope you subscribe and stay tuned for tomorrow's live stream. I hope you have a nice day, and bye-bye.